This is a Niche Radio podcast. Subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or log into www.nicheradio.co.za.
Welcome back to SuperDads. We are now in the third installment of our series. We don't know yet if we're going to go into a fourth or maybe even a fifth because Clive is very knowledgeable. And we've only scratched the tip of the iceberg here. And like I said, the whole purpose of this show is, Clive, he's done a great job for everyone. He's put himself out there. He's gone through an emotional amount of emotional and physical strain on things. And the point of the show is that we've got the core documents in the show notes. We are going to have follow-ups as this case progresses and other cases he has coming. And, the whole point is to ask these many different questions. Like we have the last cliffhanger from our previous recording, which we're going to answer. So that, you're not having to, track down and bombard Clive afterwards and ask him question after question with emails and documents. Everything is recorded here in one place for you as a resource that you can listen to again and again and give Clive his piece because, like you say, he's putting together a presentation. He's got some great ambitions and ideas of how he's going to be helping teaching and contribute to society again with science and law now. So, let's not bombard them. Let's focus on listening to these show notes for everyone and these clippings. And we're going to go back to answering the question you asked before, which I'm going to summarize and tell you if it's correct, is how do you, before that, we also need to cover Department of Health. We'll come back to that. How do you work with these subjective tests in terms of viewing them from a medical diagnosis point of view? Because that's on the tip of everyone's tongue here. So there's different ways of it in allopathic medicine. So one, we've got the brain, we've got the eyes. These are the different parts of the body that we can examine. So it's the brain, the eyes, there's the gut, the lungs, the heart, and the skin, and the parts within that. And all of them are interconnected. And part of it is, a simple analogy, everyone. In 2017, there was a Nobel Prize Award for chronobiology. And what they basically said is that you have a clock, an atomic clock in your eye and your brain, and that sets the synchronization for all other periphery clocks in your body. Now, when we have a disease that manifests or we have this epigenetic expressions, that disrupts these clocks being in synchronization. And then we start having these issues of disease manifesting or inflammation, chaos, pain, and so forth. And these different things we can measure with certain biometrics. So if, say, for example, we were to do, blood panel screens on you, a doctor, number one, when he first sees you, he's going to go through your demographics. So, he's going to ask you, all right, tell me about your symptom complaints. And then he will see, okay, like you said, you had some disease in the past, what medications you take, what medication are you on? He wants to find out, what's your age? What is your occupation? And more importantly now, because of this whole thing of submolecular medicine or mitochondrial medicine, we actually want to get more demographics about your mother, what kind of diseases and health she had, and your grandmother. Because mitochondrial DNA is passed on by the mother. So every expression that comes along with that is the damage inherited is going to come through that. So thankfully, mitochondrial DNA, the damage is not static. It can be altered and modified and improved upon. However, in your case, you said, okay, I'm 70 years old now, in my 70s, and why am I having such more difficulties now than I was earlier? And also with you is that your exposure was very different over your time in terms of certain EMFs or areas compared to someone of my age and compared to someone that's 10 years younger than me and 15 years younger. So, when you were growing up as a kid, very few kids, number one, had a TV set, right? Pretty much. I mean, South Africa had a TV, only in the 80s or something, I think, or 70 something?
I was 14 when first TV sets came out in Bulawayo.
Okay. But also, it wasn't everyone that had a TV set. It was only a very few elite, wealthier families that had access to a TV set.
Yep.
So that was one of our first sort of on-sites of non-native EMF or blue light that was interrupting one's circadian rhythm or causing mitochondrial DNA damage. The next thing started then coming with microwaves. So microwaves also, again, only came much later And it was only an elite few, the wealthy, that actually owned a microwave. But nowadays, pretty much every single person, particularly, sort of now it's in South Africa and US, each person has 7 microwave devices or wireless devices. And in wealthier populations, actually now becoming 15 devices per person. So these persons are carrying on them a blue light bidirectional microwave device. So it's even more expression onto the damage of the DNA. And this goes particularly more into the mothers and the fathers who are both damaging their DNA through having the phone in their pocket, having it on their tummy, and this causes expression. So like you said, you had what was considered very normal tests in Mayo Clinic for so long because you inherited much stronger mitochondrial DNA from your mother and grandmother.
They were very healthy.
Correct. Where if we compare that, say if you had another child that, a mother was having a lot of high exposure to inflammatory diseases or, a lot of blue light technology devices, and then their child has another offspring, that's why we're seeing children ending up in the ICU with, strokes, heart attacks, Alzheimer's is coming down to age 32 now.
I can't believe it. From the time I was a child, when I said, I'm seeing kids have heart attack. I'm hearing of kids having heart attacks, hearing of kids having cancer, of this disease, that disease. I said, in my whole school career, the only issue we had was one girl had her arm bitten off by a shark. That was the biggest news in terms of health.
Correct. And also this whole thing, what we also in science call a shifting baseline syndrome, which makes it very difficult for epidemiology studies or for a court to look at it, because a neurologist would even, the ones I consult with, who would say, well, depression is becoming the new norm. Before it used to be a very rare thing with patients. Now it's like, hey, 4 out of 10 patients. Now it's 6 out of 10 patients, 7 out of 10 patients. It's like a normal thing. So people think, well, depression is normal, but it's not normal. It's abnormal. The same in children.
Well,
yeah.
I've suddenly realized that with the increase of cell phone tower and cell phone radiation from the 90s, that, one of the symptoms is depression, tiredness and depression.
Correct.
So it's not normal. No, it's not.
So what ties in there, one of the tests that one looks at is there's a thing called DHA. Now, DHA we find in omega-3 and fish oil. Okay. And DHA is vitally important for enabling a DC current within our body. So in the last 2 interview segments, you talked about these ion channels or electrical circuits being moved through our body. And in order to have those electrical circuits possible, we have to have collagen, which again, molecular components. But again, the key thing is DHA, and DHA enables that electrical current. And our brain itself requires an immense amount of DHA. I mean, our eyes have the highest amount of DHA. So DHA, which couples with retinol, which is called vitamin A, we find in our eye, that very weak covalent bond is broken every time we see a blue light stimulus. So there's a thing called a melanopsin receptor found in the eye and the skin. So when we are exposed to this artificial blue light during the daytime and at nighttime, it destroys DHA, and very importantly, it destroys melatonin. Now, melatonin is actually produced in the morning and it's released at nighttime in our bodies. When we expose this light, and again, the microwave radiation, it kills this. We're not able to release melatonin at nighttime. And melatonin is vitally important for many circadian functions and vitally important for repairing mitochondrial DNA damage. So you mentioned in a previous interview where your body's having all these signals, not going left, right, center, I don't know what's going on, but this unique process for a body to go to this repair mechanism and regeneration is being disruptive. So this whole mental decline or this problem with sleep, again, the Nobel Prize Award 2017 was released in chronobiology, showing how this disruption to sleep is a big cause for all these diseases. So, in terms of, this is what I love about law, is a thing called universal law. So if there's a principle in physics like Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared, or a photoelectric effect that they got a Nobel Prize Award on, you don't have to replicate a study. You don't have to have you subjected to all these medical tests to prove that the radiation can damage you, because you just have to reference these Nobel Prize awards, and you don't have to, it can be from anywhere in the world, and the judge would automatically recognize it without question. The interesting thing, that's what
I'm sorry, I agree with you that what happens is I'm saying I have these medical conditions at the same time that the tower was put in, and they're getting progressively worse within a very short period of time, 3 or 4 months.
Yeah.
Here are medical scientific papers which all show that this not only that this happens, but how it happens. And so I'm saying, well, the only argument the other side can have is to come along and say, oh, but you're doing drugs. Oh, we found you have a condition that will cause that. Or bluntly, you're lying.
That's the key thing here, where we use, again, a doctor is going to look at your demographic data first. So, he will also look at, okay, you worked close to power lines and electrical equipment. You did a lot of computer programming, so you're subjective to the high blue light exposure, indoor environment. So therefore, you were subject to a lot of mitochondrial DNA damage. And at the same time, you also were in an environment where the wireless signals were propagating highly, very strong. So your body was just going over and over on this damage, getting worse and worse and worse. Give me a second. My dog just wants to go out to the bathroom quickly. Hold on, just pausing here. Okay, quickly back from that. So what we find is, again, a doctor's job, he has a license. He's empowered by the law to allocate whatever diagnosis, ICD-10 codes, or now 11 codes that he so chooses and wishes. And then if he is questioned, it's his job to use his skills and training and knowledge to give a diagnosis of what he feels, and within means, financial means for the patient, to do diagnostic tests to help with it. The trouble is, like I said in the previous recordings, that doctors are not trained in physics and don't understand this physician issue of understanding disease. If they try approach it from a biochemistry point of view or background, they are never going to understand or diagnose. So that's why this process of me being, the government investing in me to study more and research and development these mitigation option solutions into the physics, into biochemistry, so that it can then be translated into training doctors in this process over years. However, that's the whole point of your application to court, is that we don't have the luxury of waiting years to do waiting for this. We have to take action now. And wow, what's going on? Let me disable my Skype here quickly.
Okay,
sorted. All right, so that's why it's also important that your court order was upheld for this very reason. And what comes into this, I'm segueing here. We're going to come back to the medical test now. Is that in the matter with Telkom saying that, or the judge said you have to provide scientific evidence. What's key here, like I said, you're both providing narratives in the literature or wording, and the judge doesn't necessarily know enough about the words of each of them. And it's important to stand in court and to narrate what is actually the meaning of these words. So, they would reference the word guideline, and guideline is very different to word standard in law and legislation. And the whole thing of, they try to use the word limit. They say guideline limit, but actually we don't have that in South Africa. And the technical word is a reference guideline or reference level. And again, reference level is very different to limit. So all these different words, like you also mentioned, the thermal effect versus non-thermal. So the whole time is that in court, you would be arguing again and again, or that's what my research and thesis did, was pointing out that when they say one word, you need to elaborate on that. What do you actually mean by this? So it's kind of, they taking approach like we saw with the administrative application, where they took shortcuts, they didn't do check boxes. They chose to be very conservative with the truth. So conservative with the truth, an example for our listeners is, not me, actually, it wouldn't be the case, but someone comes home at night, They're wobbling and tipsy, and the wife says, "Hey, how much you've been drinking?" And you're very drunk. You had all these whiskeys and everything else. And the husband says, "You know what, honey, I promise you, I didn't have one drink. I promise you, I had 3, 4, 5, 6, but I did not have one." But he admits saying 3 or 4, 5, 6 drinks. And the same thing comes from, the ICNIP or the telecom guys, is that they are saying, we got a license or permit from the city to install the cell tower. We're just omitting to state under what terms and conditions and language this is the case. So them saying that the radiation is perfectly safe from a biological perspective is 100% correct, provided that you associate it with the terms and conditions of which they use that word. So if you use a cell phone for 5 minutes and not longer, and you're not taking into account all these other repercussions, or not using it for extended periods of time, and you're holding it so far away from your body, yes, under those biochemistry standards of evaluation, it is safe. Just like when you did your testing for magnetic interference or radio interference microwave in that shielded copper room, you had a checklist, and you said this equipment was not affected under these very specific parameters.
Yes.
And then the marketing guy would go after and say, this is 100% safe, no problem. And we have a similar thing with cell towers and AM transmitters, which wasn't brought into the argument, a thing called spurious emissions. What spurious emissions is that different countries have different rules where the frequency of transmission has to be in a very specific spectrum wavelength, and it can't leak out into others. And different countries have different regulations for it. So Europe's very strict. America only has protection on the GPS signal, nothing else. It's free for all. So what happens when we have spurious emissions is that you would have a case of an AM tower that could be interfering with 2 cell phone transmitters. And that creates interference on the line, or electromagnetic interference. And that creates more amplified biological harm. But from a communications platform, it creates this interference issue. And that's then where technically Carson needs to drive out with a van or truck, that they have a Land Rover with a big transmitter or receptor on the top, and they're meant to drive around and pick these up. However, what's key thing is with the plans that was submitted in the documents, there was no proof that they had an ICASA license, that the ICASA license was properly authorized either, and that they're not interfering with these other issues. Those are other things that came up with it, which are very key. So I think that's a game thing for our listeners, is that they try to say, oh, the WHO said it's safe. Again, that's another conservative truth. It's only one subdivision of WHO that has very key words in terms of conditions. However, the World Health Organization is made up of multiple groups and multiple countries of those groups. And they each have a different review on the science, a different opinion. So to globally say that the WHO says it's perfectly safe from what they've said is a lie, number one. And you have the same right to say also, the WHO says it's not safe, because if you're asked to use the same language as they are in terms of not disclosing everything and the reasons. So that's a very interesting thing.
If we jump back to the beginning, where if you've got somebody who claims, let's put it this way. A tower, people start learning about all of this stuff, and they read it up and so on. And they learn of a tower coming into their backyard, and they say, ooh, let's see, I better start developing symptoms. And they start saying, I've got this, I've got that, and everything. How can you tell a genuine person from, can you tell? I know there are ways to look at inconsistencies, but are there medical tests that can say, this person follows the tests follow, or I'm trying to figure out how a medical person would say, this guy's on the level, but this one isn't.
Yeah. And the answer is yes, but you're also not going to like what I'm going to tell you. So in terms of non-native EMF, literature tends to be very discriminatory of saying one is more important than the other. And the different bands is we have light, artificial light is the primary contaminant or issue for these diseases. Second
Mhm.
comes magnetic fields. Third comes the wireless or microwave radiation in terms of having the strongest biological impact. However, as 5G is being rolled out, we are finding that's changing, and 5G or the wireless becomes the primary issue of causing disruption. So that also becomes quite tricky with the argument. So your blue light exposure, and like with you, you had the magnetic field exposure at 50 hertz in your younger youth, and then when you're into US, it was a 60 hertz. So 60 hertz does a different biological effect compared to the 50 hertz. So those two cause the biggest disruption first, and then your body has a higher accumulation. So we mentioned earlier about the thing of transition metals, and when you're having a poor redox, your body is not able to flush out those metals. So naturally, your body would flush out those contaminants when you have a good redox. So hence, chemical sensitivity disappears. So how we do these medical tests is, yes, there's what's his name now? There's first is Robert Obeka, who did a very nice book that showed these effects with medicine and showed how bone growth and DC current is linked and can be demonstrated. Then there was a colleague of his. The name will come back to me. Very, very clever guy. I think the book is called The Body Electric Effect. It will come back to me. But anyway, he wrote a very good book and he did a lot of tests and studies for the US, and has shown how, doing these brain scans, electrical conduits can measure these signal interferences and pain reception and so forth that you mentioned. However, in his testimony, he says these tests to set up and construct are very, very expensive. So it's not, necessarily feasible for the average person. But again, it doesn't mean it can't be done.
They have to be, because they've got to be so discriminatory, and they're measuring very, very small, unusual things.
Correct. So that's one of the tests. Also, again, if we look at an MRI image, we look at the T2 weighted images specifically, and we look at sort of the deuterium content within the brain, and we look at the effect, of how it is on the limbic system. And we also see how what's called a proton shadow zone, how those are being affected. Now, in terms of reading MRI images in that way, there's only, less than about 10 people in the world that know how to properly read these MRI images. It's something that I'll be doing in my research. It's simple to do once you understand, but it's a bit more trickier. But that's another way of doing it. Again, it's about pattern association. Other things we can look at also, like a person having myopia, that's, person needing to wear glasses more and more. So again, we're seeing that effect from the blue light, but again, loss of DHA, it's about the link to the brain, and there's a drop in dopamine levels. So you mentioned about how there's this like depression, feeling down, your IQ dropping, your EQ dropping. So when a person has lower dopamine levels, their ability to actually even think is narrowed. They become shrunken in. So that's why, devices become very addictive.
I agree with
and
that.
When you raise the dopamine levels, like we do the protocols to do that, a person is able to think laterally, and they're able to connect the dots better. So dopamine is a hunting molecule. It's a track builder, and it helps direct us on things. Other things, there was a very famous test by Volkov, who showed that when exposed to the radiation, it used an fMRI image to show how there's the increase in glucose metabolism in the brain. So that's another way of demonstrating these effects on you. You can also have a lumbar puncture to show, a perforated blood-brain barrier. You can also have your gut examined to see, leaky gut, which also which happens. We see it more with more 4G. We're seeing that effect. So again, what's difficult here for the physician to understand the physics to the biochemistry or allopathic medicine is that each frequency band or radiation frequency is going to have a different effect on the cells, and thereby different symptoms. So it's a picture we're drawing here. Simpler ways is, doing a blood analysis as well. So I look at your bun creatine ratio levels, and that lets me see the whole dehydration effect in your cells. So remember earlier I talked about hydrophilic versus hydrophobic aspects. And if your cells are heavily dehydrated, even if you're drinking, like say, doctor, I'm drinking 4 liters of water a day, and you're still showing a poor dehydration level, That's because the radiation is affecting your transition metals and affecting, again, the calcium efflux, magnesium. And often a doctor, he would show you that you have low magnesium levels or low energy. And he would administer of you to take a magnesium supplement. That's the worst thing anyone can do. And that's why you would see often patients get worse. So it's a very fine balance that when you're dehydrated and you take magnesium, because you actually need water for these a myriad of chemical signals to take place. So if you take magnesium supplement and you take the wrong one as well, then it's going to cause more disruption. You're going to feel more tired, more fatigue. So normally we do a protocol of 3 different magnesiums, and we do a few other adjustments for that. So yeah, magnesium test would help.
Now, one of the issues, of course, is that my symptoms got worse and worse and worse. And I got the meter. I realized where the hot spots were. I could actually feel them before the meter, so I knew where the hot spots were. And when I went into the garage, there was a transition period in which things started to come right. And of course, now the tower's off. So we've gone from 3,000 down to 1 or less. That is a massive change. In the garage, I was at about 30.
But again, for our listeners out there, the unit of measurement you're talking about is microwatts per meter squared, correct?
That's correct.
All right.
Yes. And also peak.
Yes.
Because
and also, as I understand, there's a lot of it went out of the range of your meter as well.
Yes. Well, that's why I say 3,000. The way I could extrapolate past the meter was to switch over to the RMS, and then I knew the ratio of RMS to peak pretty much followed a certain pattern. So if the RMS was at a certain value, extrapolating that gives me the 3,000. Yeah. But I do not want to go back into a situation where, okay, for medical tests, we're going to, it's like radiation poisoning. You say, oh, you had radiation poisoning, you had these symptoms, and we moved you out of the radiation. Well, we want to now make sure that it is the radiation poisoning. So do you mind going back into the radiation zone, killing yourself off, perhaps, and then we can say, oh, yeah, it was the radiation that killed him.
Yeah, thankfully, we don't need to go to that kind of extreme, and we actually do a flip side of it. So like I said, there's other blood tests you can do. There's vitamin D, vitamin A, cortisol, DHEA, melatonin levels, cortisol, thyroid. We look at even a blood smear to look at your red blood cells. To have spikes or borders on them instead of being nicely spherical. We look at coenzyme Q. Yeah. We look at also.
I've done some of the other hormonal and various other. The doctor and I sat down and said, what sort of tests? And I said, look, anything that disrupts DNA, anything that disrupts cells, anything. So we went through it, and I'd have to look at them.
Yeah, but also a key thing which it won't know, I understand, is that it's not just about looking at a single test. You have to combine the results to actually in an equation or algorithm, and that gives you a ratio explanation of what's happening from a physics point of view and into the biochemistry of the body.
Yes, yes.
So I mean that's quite, and also there's synonyms to it. So one test you probably would have sent you for was a highly sensitive CRP test, which is an equivalent for coenzyme Q10. So if you have inflamed levels of your high sensitive CRP, that's a synonym for a poor DC current and poor collagen within your system. So we want to have a good electrical current, but you're having a poor electrical current. So again, that means you're going to have less water in your system as well.
When I had before I started taking antifungals, and the fungus was starting to dramatically affect my body, my abdomen and torso was so inflamed the doctor couldn't touch me.
Yeah.
My C-reactive protein, the CRP, was showing extreme levels. And of course, what happens there is that, earlier also you mentioned repair, and this is a huge issue, is that our cells, I was totally surprised that each cell in our body has 1,600 damages per day. And the body takes care of that. It repairs it all.
Yeah.
Now, if you add microwave radiation or other chemical or drug problems or whatever, stress, etc., that rate of repair, that rate of damage is number one going to go up. But if you sustain it, your body gets tired in terms of repair, and you start getting static cells. They don't divide anymore. They don't go into apoptosis, but they do. They don't commit suicide, but they don't divide. So you age. Aging is when your cells remain static. They don't divide anymore, so you don't stay young by I've got a lot of old cells.
We call it an increase in your heteroplasmy rate, meaning the damage to your mitochondrial DNA, basically.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. Basically, it is. It starts to accumulate. Yeah. So when they say, I mean, if you look at the affidavits, they say, "Oh, it's aging." Well, in some ways, they're right. Within 3 months, they managed to age me 10 years.
Actually, more so. If we look at,
well, they nearly aged me about 30 or 40 and put me in my grave.
Well, the tricky thing also, the heteroplasmy rate, that's what you also asked about. Why am I different to somebody else? So you said you had good genes from your mother and your grandmother, and different parts of our body have different heteroplasmy or mitochondrial DNA damages. So, for example, a person with cystic fibrosis, which means that they're basically operating on 1/3 of the lung capacity of you and I, they can have a very bad heteroplasmy rate in their pancreas. So even though the guy is maybe 30 or 35 years old, he has a pancreas of a 70-year-old. So therefore, he has to take adaptation mechanisms to reduce the heteroplasmy rate in that pancreas of his. So that, I mean, other tests you can do, I mean, you can go for genetic screening. So it's things like GSTT1, GSTM1. And this is done by DeLuca et al. Study where it showed that these persons lack a certain enzyme that makes them less efficient at processing non-native EMFs, particularly the microwave and magnetic fields. So,
I can't afford all these tests. Do I say to them, "You pay for them, I'll take them"?
Well, that's what actually happens with what I understand from your judge's order. They have to provide scientific proof that their radiation is not affecting you.
Okay.
So that's why, from a strategic point of view for them, this is my opinion, it's not fact, is that it's more cost effective for them to take the blow under the Administrative Law Act and not challenge the health aspect on you. Because, I mean, this is why my research hasn't been brought up legally, in my opinion, or being sued against the university, because therefore there has to become a balance of probabilities and presentation of evidence.
I said to them when they said we will swamp you with scientific evidence, I said, "Bring it on, because you'll lose."
Correct. I mean, and then also
I would actually love it, because it will actually make a statement that their science is bad and wrong.
Yeah. I mean, I think also what can be done here, I mean, if they wanted to do, say, a testing on you. So already the order's been gone forward that the transmitter is turned off. So the judge could order someone, say, like me, to come in and design a treatment protocol for you. So what the argument is that, is it really the cell phone tower, or is there environmental stimulus in your area that is causing your contamination or issues? And again, we look at your demographics. So with me, I would, design a treatment protocol for you and work with your doctor. And then what we do is we show the difference in your redox potential improving, and what we call redox pop. So what happens is when your redox pop is improved, we can then take you, this has happened for people around the world, we can take you to a place where there are cell phone towers and you'll be relatively fine. And again, the reason why I said redox pop is that we can give you, say 6 or 7, 8 weeks where you really have high tolerance to it, because we're putting you back to a healthier state or regeneration. But the key thing is here is that if the cell phone tower is put on at night, particularly, right, then that's going to affect your repair mechanisms. So it can be the thing of, we show listen, your degradation, you said you saw your doctor beforehand, you've been citing you're feeling worse, cell phone tower is off. You're in a state now where you're still being affected, where even, it happens to some people, I don't know if, or saying it's the case with you, is that your cells experience a type of PTSD, meaning just the visual seeing of the object can cause a trigger stress response. So this happens with people. That's why they try to say, oh, it's in the head. They try to do the sham studies. But the whole thing is, if we do the protocol where we show that, hey, you've gotten better, and we can show it with your blood results and your scan results and so forth, and then they put on the cell phone tower again, and you'll see that your body's going to start having a drop. But the thing is, they don't have to put it on again. We just have to show that your body can be brought to an elevated state again.
Okay.
So that will be determined, again, in my job here with my research, is that I am a contracted agent to look at the best solution for both parties. So if I was contracted by the government and or the cell phone tower, I would look at what's the best feasible solution for both you as the private citizen, the government, and the cell phone company. Meaning, how can the cell phone tower be modified differently? Can alternative technology be utilized? Can different mitigation options be employed to help you with your symptoms or your issues? Because like with
first of all, the visual impact of this tower was dramatic. It was wrong. It was the wrong place to put it from every point of view. The judge accepts it. They didn't follow protocol. And if they followed protocol, there is no way that it could get past the national building regulations, which say it mustn't derogate from the neighborhood. And this is so obvious. You couldn't make it more obvious than putting it in our swimming pool.
Absolutely. I mean, there's another matter I got contracted recently where, in terms of property value. So I've been in other matters beforehand where, showing there's a drop in property value. But in the case of this new matter being brought on, the property, this was a evaluation from the bank and what was given from the neighborhood. The property dropped in value by 8 million rand. So the house was meant to sell for over 20 million. The person bought, I think, for 14 or 16 million. I can't remember the exact amount, but there was he showed evidence that there was an 8 million rand drop because of the cell phone tower on the neighboring property, similar to your case where it's on the borderline.
Well, the studies basically in Australia showed that a few houses away, it has a slight difference, but the ones right next to the property, it's a major impact. And the thing is that the studies, South African law, they use the word, it must have a significant impact. In other words, not just a few percent. It has to be 10% is beginning to become significant. 20% is definitely significant.
You mean in terms of impact on the property value or on the health effects?
Property value.
Yeah, correct. So often, when we see numbers of 15 to 25%, then yes, we're seeing those significant effects as you've experienced.
Yes.
Even for Telkom to say you must relocate, for you to try to sell your property, it's not going to work. And you made an investment to be in that home. You're in your later times, you're mature adult.
My wife once wanted her son to inherit the property, and we would move into a retirement home. And they were happy to do that. Once they saw the cell tower, the son's wife said, no way, because of health hazard, that I'm staying.
Yes.
I'm staying in that property. The tower has to go if I'm going to stay there.
Is this also the same property that you and your late wife shared, or did you migrate to a new property?
No. My late wife was an American, and we stayed in another part of Joburg.
Okay.
My present wife has got a well-established family and circle of friends, and has been in same neighborhood, same house for 42 years.
Correct. So all the more reason to support that there was an investment and maintenance of the cultural heritage and practice of the area and community.
Thank you for that. I like that input.
Another key thing, which I was meant to have an interview with some of the rabbi and a Catholic priest. It sounds like a beginning of a joke here. But actually what we found is that the way, again, we have a thing of how the radiation breaks covalent bonds. It affects dopamine levels. It affects the photons in our head, our fingers, and our feet. It affects the inverse Hall magnetic field effect. So from a religious point of view, the radiation, again, I'm talking about the non-native EMF encompassment, actually interrupts one's ability to connect with God. I know we're going a bit weird here.
I will agree with that. I will agree with that.
And so a simple basic explanation is the reason why, we pray, we have our hands together or cupped and we bring it to our head. Both of those emit high amounts of photons or light energy. And sort of bringing those two together enables this, I guess, electrical and chemical energy and connection. And typically one would actually do it on the bare ground, and we have this wireless connection. So we're talking about the photons with the sun and the wireless connection receiver to the earth. And this is what enables this connection and ability. So that's why when we find, like I mentioned earlier, one of the tests we do is see how your dopamine levels have dropped and your IQ and EQ drops and your connection of understanding nature or your surroundings dissipates. And, actually I've done it, experience with the protocol where we raise people's dopamine levels and they go from a point of having writer's block, or they're not able to write poetry anymore, or they're not having stories, or they become a low dopamine asshole, as we call it. And again, the last thing you want to do is have a doctor who's a low dopamine asshole, because it never works well. But once they go through this protocol and they actually start raising dopamine levels, would you believe it that within a short span of time, they're writing again, they're rereading poetry. I just have 2 doctors now that actually I've started writing books now, something they hadn't been able to do for years. And they're actually, expressing what they're learning and experiencing through this whole process.
With me, the radiation was such that it was actually incapacitating me. I was non-functional. I was becoming non-functional, and I thought, here I am. I'm a self-represented litigant. I have to learn the law. I have to learn the science. I've got a bunch of other commitments that I've got, which I have to deal with, and I'm having one hand tied behind my back at the same time. It really was bad. If I moved away for a week, it got so bad. I moved away for a week, and what a difference that made. And I could tell. I didn't really relate it so much to the tower radiation, but I said, I've got to get away because I can't function. And then once I started sleeping in the garage, it was cumulative. It took a little bit of time and working in the garage, it took a bit of time, but I became back to my old functional self.
A key thing is sort of why it takes you longer to recover. Actually takes, you'll probably find a pattern of about 10 to 14 days, which is, like you said, you go to the bush to recover. There's a hormone which it starts with a D. It eludes my mind now. Anyway, what happens is when we have that extreme stress like you're having now, it gets depleted. And it takes about 10 to 14 days for it to be replenished naturally within our system. So that's why the chronic fatigue, you see this pattern of when you have exposure, it takes so much time for you to recover when you're in an environment that isn't impacting you. So again, that's how we use the science to explain this linkage between it.
Okay.
But again, it's not just also the thing of your cognitive effects, it's also your social relationships. So I find, we implemented the protocol with couples that are going through marriage counseling. And when they implement the protocol, and again, we're raising the dopamine levels and they're connecting, would you believe it that in a short span of time, they no longer are on the brink of divorce and they're no longer seeing their marriage counselor? So months and years of arguing with a marriage counselor is dissipated, no longer relevant, because we're changing neurochemistry in the brain. The same thing happens with children. I mean, we had an earlier episode, we went into extreme detail with a neurosurgeon and discussing how non-native EMF qualifies as child abuse. And again, it goes with the myelinating the brain or the development of the brain. And again, we go into a lot of detail with it on that episode. So we'll have in the show notes again for our listeners. But the key thing is here is that when a child, and again, like in the same issues, when the child brain is being affected, remember I said the limbic system, the IQ, EQ, the neurochemistry is being affected. It's going into sugar drive with the glucose, like we mentioned earlier, the study with Volkov. The brain is not in a receptive state to actually have a wise conversation. A child, you can't just tell a child, listen here, be disciplined or do this. That you have to first change the environment, re-regulate this neurochemistry, and then you can have a sound and reasonable conversation. And you mentioned in your court documents that you and your wife are both being affected, where cognitively in your relationship, you're having trouble communicating. You have being more irritable, there's sort of the depression, and you're having these irrational fights and these irrational mood swings and like aggression. Like you just, again, this outburst of aggression comes because it's a way, or abuse of aggression is a way of getting control on something. So you're losing your senses, you're losing your ability to hear even, and your wife,
because of my past, I'm able to recognize and moderate that. But my wife has never experienced something like this before, and I've got to say, hold on, cell tower talking. And we good communicators, and we're well suited, so there is no problem. But it has caused friction.
Yeah, and like you said, when you move away from it and you both start to get better, or your redox starts to improve, then you notice, wow, our relationship's improving. What happened?
We're seeing that over the last few days.
So, I mean, at least, for the judge, from a testing point of view, it is able to be demonstrable. And I guess, what sometimes frustrates me, or it's a blessing for me, is beginning this year, God was very kind to give a very strong shift through my own personal health failures of shifting my research and moving again to this quantum biology, submolecular medicine, biophysics kind of thing. And it enabled me to get a very strong understanding of much more than what I did before. So my previous research, my thesis, government-funded study, working with different organs of state and municipalities and different participants, it was able to demonstrate this non-native EMS as a public interest override, and how it is an environmental substance into the environment, and it can cause harm in these different circumstances. And it also did provide a roadmap, a model and framework that municipalities can employ to regulating these illegal towers and these emissions and so forth. But what I found, I don't know if it was maybe by choice or by accident, you didn't reference that government-funded study or government study in your application. I don't know if it's because it didn't have access to it, or if it was not seen as relevant.
I looked at it, and I had a certain roadmap layered through, and so on and so forth. And I focused on the VG, CC, plus a little bit of ciprofloxacin, plus a bit of a storyline. Before, there was something that I wanted to say that is gay. Before it jumps out of my mind, which it's doing, I was holding back and saying, I got to remember that point. Oh. Okay, no, sorry. It'll come to me in a minute, and when it does, I'm going to interrupt.
Yeah, that's fine. Well, going back to the first or second episode of this series, like I said, I had a consultation with you 6 months ago, and I purposely reserved back on saying how you should do things. And again, the key thing here was, like I said, you had a strategy of how you're going to do things, and you did follow the same path anyway as my thesis, where you focused on the PAJA, the administrative law, and then you demonstrated the health effects as well. So you followed the exact same structure. Like I said, when I chatted with you, I said your structure's on board. Don't take too much of my ideas. Just keep going what you're doing, because it's on the right path. And you've managed to succeed, which is important as well, because you got to demonstrate that there's different ways of tackling the situation with your ability, being a researcher for many years, being an examiner.
Now's the interruption.
Yes.
It's popped back. This cell tower is going to go because of the way in which it was approved, and the fact that it's unsightly and it's badly sited. And they probably won't want to take me on the health issue. The let's say it had to stay here. In order to lessen the radiation, typically what they tell people is that their antenna are focused. They send it out over our heads, and that the radiation levels close to the tower are actually lower than anybody else has, which is not true. The highest radiation levels are right next to the tower, as I'm experiencing now. For example, one can focus the antenna so that they do more power is thrown out and over, but you do get side lobes. I thought, well, what maybe they could put like an inverse umbrella where underneath the antenna they put a water bath, because water absorbs radiation. So anything that is going down towards our house just gets absorbed and warms the water slightly, so that they would actually create a radiation pattern that would go, it obviously would spill over, but it wouldn't be direct. Because if I went up there and I put a 3-meter skirt and filled it with a 3-meter skirt of water-soaked wood, we wouldn't get direct radiation. It would be like a umbrella. You know, let's say, consider the antenna to be a light, you know, shining on us. It's like putting a cover underneath so it shines further out, but not underneath.
However, the inverse with that is that a tower is designed to have participants or interactive participants with it. So as like we talked about in the beginning, was each person has, you know, 7 devices, or even more so now, coming to 15, you know, wireless bidirectional microwave devices, you know, to their ownership. So it's not just the tower transmitting down, it's also all the other idiots around you that are being misled, that are raising the ambient radiation levels.
But what people don't realize with the tower is the difference in level. So, for example, the amount of radiation coming from your device to the tower is in the level of 1,000 to 10,000 to 1,000,000. The radiation is just so strong next to the tower, compared to anything that you would have in your house.
Correct. And the thing is, that's where they often refer, that's called the inverse square law. The greater the distance, the less radiation you're going to have. Yes. And that's also where they talk about power density. And the argument of power density has been relevant from 0G to 4G. However, with 5G, power density is no longer in the argument spectrum, because you being an engineer and so forth, you would have, if you look at the MIMO technologies, that the engineers have cleverly actually manipulated the front end wave of the signal. So it's engineered differently, and therefore it's not just about, you can have a much lower power density, but you have a much stronger impact on the cellular biology of our cells.
Yeah.
So again, that's I think also you reference in your document where the argument of putting more cell phone towers lowers the cumulative level of radiation exposure. There was that part of the argument. However, as you said, also more towers means higher ambient radiation levels. More users are going to use the devices, and there's more close proximity. And then now the issue with the 5G is that, again, the levels will go lower, sure, in terms of power density, but the emergence of biological impact is going to raise. And that's what the Nobel Prize Awards demonstrate to us and explain to us.
Yes. There's another interesting aspect, which is when your cell phone first communicates with the tower, both your cell phone and the tower go to maximum. And after they get to chat at maximum, they shout at each other, and then they say, well, we're hearing each other, tone it down, tone it down, tone it down. Okay, I can hear you, we don't have to shout anymore. The problem is that duration of shouting gives you very high levels of radiation. And because one antenna is taking care of 8 phones at a time, this one drops off, and then the next time round, it's at maximum. This one drops off the next time round, it's at maximum. So what's happening is you are getting pulsations of very high power, and then high power, low power, high power, low power. That pulsation causes a whole range of different symptoms. It is actually a new ball game. Those pulsations are very damaging.
No, it is. And going back to earlier about the different frequencies have different effects, and also that high versus low pulsation. So we take it to a reference analogy of you having a fight with your wife. Your wife can raise her voice and she can spur an immense amount of emotional strain and stress on you. And whether she's shouting once per second or once every few minutes, that's the one thing. But then you have, let's say both of you have an argument, and just by her looking at you or being in the same room as you, you feel that EMF coming off of that presence. And again, it triggers the stress reaction within you, and you feel down, you feel depressed, your cognitive performance declines. So that's a different type of signal that's being emitted. It's very small, but you're still getting that stress response. And that's what people tend to negate, where they think, oh, it must be this big thing all the time or multiple times. It's different amounts or different ways are going to have different stress reactions. And that's where biochemistry becomes a very complicated focus area.
The cell industry discounts dosage completely. They say it doesn't matter whether it's 6 minutes or 6 years. It's irrelevant. And the answer is, no, it's not. The reason that with ionizing radiation, you have dosimeters, is your body can tolerate a certain amount of radiation and repair itself. But if you keep on pumping radiation into people, their bodies are going to collapse.
All right, let's wrap it up for this part of the session. We're going to be back to the next, it's probably going to be the final excerpt. We're going to focus more on, again, practical tips and more on the legal side, wrapping up. Be back in a few secs.
Okay, so
For more, visit www.nicheradio.co.za.